So, warmly welcome to our next session, Hybridity of Hybrid Threats Response of the Baltic States. And I'm very glad to have a super panel here with, from my right here first, Elīna Lange-lonatamišvili, who's a senior expert at the NATO StratCom Center of Excellence here in Riga. Then next, Dr Ainius Lašas, from the Kaunas University of Technology and Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities there. And then Viktorija Rusinaite, who's a senior analyst of the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki. And then, last but not least, James Appathurai, Deputy Assistant Secretary General at NATO for Emerging Security Challenges. And we will discuss here hybrid threats and also the response from the Baltic States. And I've asked the panel to dwell on 5 aspects, 5 questions to this. And we're trying to take stock, but also come up with some ideas where we need to go from here on recommendations for the politicians. The first aspect is, the question is, do we really have a common strategic culture? Do we have a common understanding what hybrid threats are? The second one is, how do we get a good situational awareness, a holistic situational awareness? Hybrid threats are composite and they're complex, and they're also created to, exercised in order to create confusion. So how do we really understand and know what's going on? The third one is resilience, or deterrence by denial. How do we strengthen our societies, our political systems, to be prepared for hybrid threats? The fourth one is perhaps a more intellectually challenging one, and that's, do we have the toolbox for countermeasures? How do we respond to hybrid threats? How do we think in terms of hybrid deterrence? We know what military deterrence is, but what is hybrid deterrence? And the last question is, do we do these things alone in the nation state or in the international cooperation? Of course, we need to do both. And sometimes we hear this concept of deterrence by coalition when we work together. So, Elīna, I thought that you would kick off with some reflections on these questions.
Thank you. Good morning. I will probably start by considering 2 big concepts. One is deterrence and the other one is resilience. So, if we think about the 2, deterrence is something that is down to the state, to the government to implement. But resilience is something that should come from within, the society. And when I think about these 2, I'm afraid we are not very good at what I would call expectation management, because my impression is that we as a society look at the government. So what are you doing? Why aren't you taking care of this? And then the government looks back at the society with kind of the same framing. So each feels they have done their part and that the other side is not quite delivering. So I'm oversimplifying this, of course. But the idea is that these 2 should meet in the middle with the understanding that, 1, hybrid threats are hitting us constantly from all directions across a variety of domains. Secondly, government response to these threats is not always sufficient, or it's not sometimes even possible. Thirdly, resources are and always will be limited, so be those financial or human, and we need to prioritize. So there will be always a limitation to what a government can actually do, and this is what society needs to understand. And the last point, that security of the country is indeed a shared responsibility, so it does not lie with the government or the society, it lies with both. So during the past decade, Baltic countries have been embedding this idea of shared government and societal responsibility in public discourses and also in government policies. And if we understand strategic culture as a reflection of shared cultural, normative, moral, and historical understandings, then one could argue that we are seeing a certain evolvement in the Baltic strategic culture. Often those are external shocks that shake up countries' strategic culture and trigger change. An example to that, I believe, is Sweden's and Finland's application to NATO. But for the Baltic countries, these main triggers have been Russia's attacks on Estonia, 2007, Georgia, 2008, Ukraine, 2014, and now we all know this list. But I think what is interesting that after 2014, all Baltic countries in their national security concepts have placed a greater importance on the cognitive domain. So saying that we need to protect national information space from foreign hostile influence, limit possibilities of hostile actors to manipulate public opinion, and also to improve the relationship and therefore improve possibility for cooperation and interaction between state structures and population, and raise cognitive resilience of the population as a whole. So the expectation is there that the governments and citizens alike will contribute to this increased cognitive security. But I would argue that we need to be better at spelling it out to our citizens in particular. What does it actually mean in practice, this shared responsibility for security, how it is understood, and how exactly each and every one of us can contribute to it. So in an ideal world, we would like to see a society which is proactive, involved, shares the same core values, and has a similar understanding of threats. But that is not easy to achieve in an environment where media is fighting for survival in a small niche language markets, and parts of societies are confronted with economic hardship and carry the historical consciousness of being detached from anything to do with governance or development of the state. And I won't even go into this subject about those parts of population that have been living for decades in the information space of a different and hostile state, namely Russia. So I think Ukraine's example has demonstrated to us that how our populations think about their own country and its future, how united and ready they are to confront or resist any kind of threat or military attack, has more weight than any modern weapon, although those two, of course, complement each other. So, last point, looking to the future, I don't think that we can or should underestimate the great benefit that the transatlantic cooperation brings to Baltic countries. But at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of every individual country to implement the countermeasures against hybrid threats. I see a great value in Sweden and Finland joining NATO because that will kind of even out the differences in strategic cultures of our country as far as security is concerned. So there will be fewer differences and more joint potential in terms of intelligence sharing and general cooperation for additional joint response mechanisms. But apart from that, we should place more focus in the Baltics on encouraging civic engagement, promoting social and political participation, strengthening media, and decreasing the distance which currently exists between authorities, media, politicians, and citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Elīna. And I think a main takeaway here is what you stressed, the shared responsibility of security. Ainius, how does things look from where you sit?
Well, from my perspective, I'll just continue maybe a little bit on that resilience theme, but I will I have 4 points, I guess, 4 needs the way I see it, and I'll try to cover them 1 minute per need. One, as an academic, I would first of all say we need to understand our societies. We talk a lot about action, but actually we first need to understand in order to then propose policies and act. And I'm not just saying, you know, during these days we talked about, oh, so many % trust NATO or don't trust NATO. That's one thing. Another thing is, how do people perceive threats here? You know, how do they react to different kind of threats? Yesterday we had a conversation with with a high-ranking colleague from a European country, and she said, "Oh, you know, I'm not sure how does all this anti-vax, you know, conspiracy theories and pro-Russian attitudes come together." Well, we were discussing about that. I'm running a project actually on this, and there are interesting answers and there are interesting findings that you can sort of come out of it and better understand what to actually do then. So my first, you know, need, I think, is to understand. The second need is to have kind of double, I guess, need. One is to have a conversation within our countries, right? There are difficult issues, and I'm thinking more about, for example, from the Baltic perspective, there are different issues that we need to face in order to build resilience of our societies, and including historical things, you know, including Holocaust, including World War II and what we were doing there, migration, that was a key issue today, and our reaction to it. Some of the things that we don't talk and we don't hear, for example, in this kind of conversation, demography. Demography for the Baltic states is a huge issue. And demography is something that underlies everything else, economy, you know, potential, defense, all kinds of things. And it's a huge issue that is sort of somewhere a bit under the carpet. And I feel like, you know, we are discussing this high stuff, but we are missing some fundamental challenges that we need to engage when we think about resilience. Conversation, so within the society, the sort of related point is among ourselves, right? For example, again, when I think, just because the topic more in the Baltic, you know, we still, I don't know how many of you know that, but we still don't have a ratified sea border between Lithuania and Latvia. I mean, that's, you know, we think about France, and Macron said something and he doesn't understand something, right? This is we, brothers and sisters, Baltic sisters together, not solving issues that are fundamental to our own security. You know, if we would have this border and maybe joint exploration of resources that are in the seabed, the situation might have been very different. In a sense, what I'm saying is that we don't do some homework here, and it could be energy in the same way, issues related to energy that, you know, we can explore this, you know, infrastructure and so on and so forth. So there are a number of issues that we need to discuss among ourselves much more seriously and take them seriously, and we don't do this. And we often look somewhere further away. So that's kind of related point about this conversation among ourselves. Finally, we need, I think we need to educate. We need to educate our publics, and not just in this kind of one-way process, but, you know, really it's about sort of discussion and building security community. For those who are, you know, have political science training or studied nationalism, the classical work of Benedict Anderson, imagined communities, right? How do we build a nation state? How do we build a security community? And I think it's through education. It's through common education that you put, whether it is, we are talking about school, universities, formal or informal. In terms of threat perception, the way you look, from my own sort of research, what you see is that history and historical experiences really matter in your perception of threats? Well, if we look at European security community, here's the interesting thing. We share Holocaust as a common experience. We share fascism as a common experience. You know what we don't share? Stalinism as a common experience. And that's something that we need to bring in. That's when we think, what's happening with France? Why don't they get it? Why don't they get about Russia, you know, this and that? In part, it relates to these things that there is no kind of connection to what happened. And I think we need to have this common background, common understanding of our security community, and then that's the basis to kind of build then, to build our security communities. So those are the 4 needs that I see.
Thank you, Ainius, and I think this was very natural continuation and segue from, you know, this is very much about the sort of the cognitive space and our mental preparedness. So, Viktorija, you've also been working with, at the Center in Helsinki on also countermeasures and what to do, how to counter hybrid threats. What's your points?
Thank you, Frederick. So I will talk today a bit about our experiences of holding tabletop exercises on deterrence of hybrid threats, and those issues that you raised, especially resilience, punishment, and international cooperation, those will shine through the main lessons learned that I will touch upon today. First of all, very shortly about the exercise. So this is exercise to deter hybrid threats. It encompasses the whole of government approach, meaning that you have representatives of different ministries and agencies building strategy against hybrid threats together at the table, and you're thinking strategically into the future. So the main 3 lessons that I will talk about today are, first one, that the whole of government team normally is not in a room together, if ever they are in a room together. Then the second thing is that the strategy is built in reality and in life, bottom up, and it's not top down. And then the third thing that I want to touch upon is that coordinated approach is the backbone of sophisticated strategy, meaning that multilateral aspects is essential for deterrence of hybrid threats. So the first lesson that I want to tell you about the whole of government approach not normally being in one room. So to build a coherent strategy against hybrid threats, you need people who have different capabilities, and you need them in one room. So when the hostile actor is thinking about the hybrid attack, I don't think they ever are like, well, we will now target the Ministry of Economy of Latvia. But our response is conditioned through different domains, and hybrid threats, they normally don't apply to those domains per se. So we have to think cross-domain, and often we need capabilities at the table that are not normally tasked with security tasks. So, for example, we talked about disinformation, right? So we could say that, we should ban the channels that spread disinformation. But to build resilience, you would actually have to have Ministry of Education, for example, at the table to improve media literacy in the long term. So having people in one room has also additional very important aspect. It makes policy making real. So normally when people don't meet and they don't talk to each other, they don't know how much time does it take to build a StratCom strategy, for example, or how much time does it take and resource to acquire weapon systems. So if you have them in a room together, you're able to build a more coherent strategy that encompasses more tools and more domains, and you can build a more realistic strategy. So the second point and the second lesson learned is about strategy being built bottom up and not top down. So we're accustomed to think about the strategy that this is something that is being put on a paper and delegated top down. And in holding these tabletop exercises, we noticed how the strategy is actually a cumulative effect of decisions, small decisions that are being made in different ministries and agencies. And these then form the strategy along with strategic documents. So strategic documents are, of course, there, but the strategy happens in interaction between those documents, people, and events to the backdrop of the strategic culture. So what kind of strategies, what kind of strategies do we build in our participating states? So first thing we noticed exercising that our strategies are very normative, and they're based on democratic values. In the exercise, we had some, let's call them malign tools, so like covert economic penalties or insincere diplomacy, and guess what? Nobody played them. Another important trait that we noticed in exercising and in building of those strategies is exactly focused on resilience. So all strategies that we witnessed being built were based on resilience. So when people had to set out their tools across time, resilience tools started first and they lasted the longest. But when the systems were shocked with, for example, war in Europe, strategies incrementally turned more punitive. So what happens if you don't have people in one room together and the strategic environment changes and people feel that their strategies should turn more punitive? So you have those strategies being built bottom up in different ministries and agencies in different stovepipes. So they are not only not covering the tools that could be there, but also what happens is that people and agencies that are normally tasked with those tasks of security, they have their own ways about resilience and punishment. And our feeling was in these exercises that then if you have people managing crisis and reacting to crisis, the strategies would be more punishment-based. Then the third thing that I wanted to touch upon, and from the lessons learned, is the coordinated approach being the backbone of sophisticated strategy. And by coordinated approach, we mean not only that the ministries and different agencies within the state should be involved, but the thing is that all of the states in Europe are normally smaller than the hostile actor they are facing. So to be able to address this hostile actor, you in a sense have to grow. And what is the way of becoming bigger, becoming more able to address this hostile actor? This is naturally belonging to the multilateral organizations such as NATO, such as EU, and working out deterrence strategies through them. So these are three things that I shortly wanted to touch upon, being people have to be in one room from different agencies. People are building strategies from bottom up, and multilateral aspects is essential in any deterrence of hybrid threats strategy. Thank you.
I think this is some really very useful, important takeaways that, policies and strategies are fine, but this is a trade craft. I mean, you have to make, you said, policy made real, so to say, and it's really people and the bottom-up approach. James, you don't sit in the Baltic States, but then have a sort of the multilateral NATO perspective, and how does things look from your perspective?
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here, and I help to oversee hybrid policy in NATO, so not with a Baltic identity, but maybe from a hybrid identity. So just a few points, I think, to maybe nourish the discussion. One is to stress that these are my views and not just not the NATO views necessarily, so that I'm now safe for future employment at NATO. I think it's important to say we're obviously focused on Russia, and that's the biggest threat. It's not just Russia. And I think it's also important that we recognize that there is a hybrid campaign against our countries. Ukraine is facing a kinetic war and a hybrid war. We are actually in the middle of an ongoing hybrid campaign against us, and we need to be on that footing. We've talked a lot about all sorts of issues. In one sentence, because I'll just make it a run-on sentence, I would list some of the elements of that hybrid campaign. All of this is well documented: election interference, cyber attacks, forced migration, threats to undersea cables, energy pressure, food pressure, disinformation. So there are a lot of tools being used against us. So what can we do about it? So I'm just going to put some thoughts and some reflections after some time in NATO and on this file. One is, we're getting better at having a common picture, but we don't have one. We still deal with these things too much on a national basis. We need to be able to predict patterns rather than individual tools or events. We need to look at patterns, and that requires a multinational approach. Second is, we're very reactive. We're like my kid when he played soccer or football. All the little boys run wherever the ball is. We're like, cyber attack, we run to the cyber attack reactively. Pipeline, we run to the pipeline. So we need to have a much more comprehensive approach. And we have to recognize that Russia in particular has not just a doctrine for hybrid campaigns, which we can all witness, but they have a headquarters for it, which they proudly put on TV, which has all the elements of state power. So this is very obvious what they're doing, and we need to be comprehensive in the way they are. Third, we respond very slowly because we are very concerned with attribution. I'll come back to attribution and identity, but our response is always extremely slow. So we can do better to move and we can do better to support each other. And that means building the tools, like we have counter-hybrid support teams, but we don't deploy them that much, so we can do better there. We don't, in most NATO countries or in most partner countries, actually have a whole-of-government approach. And I'll use one partner country, which is very well developed in whole-of-government approach, where every 6 months or so, they bring in intelligence officials, government officials, and industry officials. And the industry leaders get an overview of what the security environment is, and they decide together what they need to do as a society, companies and government, for resilience, meaning how much do you need to put aside in terms of energy resilience, in terms of foods, in terms of medicine, in terms of fuel, that yes, it's going to cost you as a society, but the industry leaders understanding the environment are willing to do it because they know they're part of society. We could replicate that in every NATO country, and I think it would make a lot of sense. Cyber defenses. This is essential. Cyber underpins every element of what we do now. And if you look at what's happened in Ukraine, people talk about how the Russian attacks weren't that successful. There has been a non-stop Russian cyber attack against every element of Ukrainian society, and it's had a lot of success, but they've managed to fight back and rebuild. But the point is, because of the effective cyber defense, which is Ukrainian first, but with support from governments and industry, essential government services are working. People can take money out of the bank. People know what to do and where to go and where their loved ones are. They can stay at home, rather than having to run. And President Zelensky is on the air motivating his people and motivating us to provide the weapons they need to fight. Cyber underpins everything. It's not a separate issue. But we are massively vulnerable in our countries because we don't take cyber security seriously, meaning putting aside a lot of money to constantly upgrade, to constantly patch, to get the right software at all levels. It's seen as something you do when, you have a problem. But I can assure you there is a deliberate Russian campaign, a cyber campaign against our critical infrastructure that they have not yet unleashed. And if we don't take care of that, we are highly vulnerable. So that's another element. We need to build disinformation build resilience against disinformation, and we talked about that. But there are fundamental steps that every government can take. For example, media literacy. My kids in Belgian school get classes on, every month, how do you tell what's true and what's not from what's not true in school. So when I tell them, you should look at the URL, they kind of roll their eyes. Yeah, Dad, we know. And they do know, actually. But we could do that across the alliance. We can do better. This is government that needs to do it. And I'll give you an example of how clever the hybrid campaign is. I spoke to somebody who runs a extremely large, if not one of the largest internet providers in the world. And he was telling me that what Russia has done is to use Spanish language social media in Mexico to influence the American electorate, because millions of Americans get their, because they're Hispanic, they get their information from Spanish language. So they get in that way. The Mexican government's not paying attention. The US government can't do anything about it. So again, we need a more comprehensive approach. We can do much better to learn from our partners. And I think of, in particular, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. They're constantly offering to us, and we're increasingly taking advantage of it to learn from their very harsh experience and take those lessons into our exercises and others. And then I get into the more complicated one, but I'll give you, again, I stress this is my personal view, but we need to be able to impose costs. You can't just always play defense. You can't just always be on resilience. To use an ice hockey analogy, which in Latvia or Sweden I can do, if you just line up all your players on the blue line and let the other team shoot, you're never going to win and you're always going to lose. So we have done that. It doesn't mean tit for tat. So for example, after certain Russian activities, a lot of NATO countries ejected a lot of their diplomats/spies. But for example, a massive Russian cyber attack does not mean that we should then counter with a Russian cyber attack, because we want to set, there is a norm that there should not be cyber attacks, for example, on critical energy infrastructure. If they do it, they're violating the norm. If we respond that way, there is no more norm. So we need to make sure that we do maintain these norms, but we do need to also respond so that there's a cost, and we're not just absorbing and absorbing. Final point I would make is that this is actually pretty urgent that we focus on this. We talked earlier about how, you know, the focus on stockpiles and military equipment is very high, but much, much worse is possible when it comes to hybrid. And I mentioned cyber attacks on critical infrastructure across the alliance. I think that's extremely plausible. Energy cutoffs can get much worse than they are now. The undersea cables, which carry not just, that carry basically our data, is highly vulnerable, and there have been, the Norwegians have had a recent experience with regard to Svalbard. There is forced migration, there's more disinformation, so this can get worse. We need to act on it. These are some ideas for how to do that.
Thank you, James, and I think an important, and thank you for your honest and frank expose, and I mean, there's absolutely no room for complacency here, and lots of room for improvement. Before we open up for questions, and I already have some questions online, and please here in the room think about some questions and I will come back to you. But first, to just pick up where you ended, James, after 2014 we started to talk about hybrid threats or, you know, hostile state action, gray zone. I mean, we had a lot of different terminology for this. But then over the last year, with the Russian military build-up along the Ukrainian border, and then especially after February 24th this year, the focus has been very much on the military kinetic side. And we're all experts on HIMARS and what have you, and drones and what have you these days. And also, to be frank, I think over the last year, and in a country like Sweden this spring, where there was a discussion whether we would join NATO or not, I think we all had expected to see more hostile sort of Russian hybrid campaigns than we have seen, not to say that there hasn't been. But are we in the risk now with this very strong focus on the military side of things, the kinetic side of things, that we are a little bit forgetting about hybrid threats or drawing the wrong conclusion? Well, that didn't turn out to be that important or that dangerous. Does anyone want to comment on this? Are we focusing too much on the military side now and forgetting about hybrid threats?
I think as far as Latvia is concerned, I think it's quite the opposite, because we are not taking part in an active military conflict with Russia, but because we are supporting Ukraine politically and militarily. From day one, we have been actually preparing for the worst, that we will be getting all kinds of hybrid attacks, starting from cyber and migration, where we have learned our lesson from 2021, Belarus. So I think, at least here, most focus, actually, I would say, has been put into preparing ourselves for these kind of hybrid attacks.
James, so you're getting less bandwidth than your military colleagues?
Well, actually, I'm pleased that NATO, and that starts from the Secretary General, but also all the ambassadors, have actually moved hybrid higher on the agenda than it was a year ago. I mean, our hybrid colleagues were generally working on exercises, and you know, I think we'd confirm that 2 years ago, if we had designed an exercise that looked like what's happening right now, the ambassadors we were talking about, the ambassadors would have sent us out of the room, like, come on, that's totally unbelievable, like, don't give us this. And now, you know, something happens every day. But no, there is a heightened interest in addressing this. The challenge we have at NATO is twofold. One is a lot of this rests with national governments, and national governments are, to a greater or lesser extent, careful about exposing all of their vulnerabilities on a 30-country platform or 32-country platform. I understand that. That's very natural, and so that there's a little bit of hesitation there. And second is, of course, that NATO doesn't control, certainly, all the tools necessary to contribute to hybrid defense. The EU also doesn't have all the tools, because hybrid is not just below the threshold, and I think that's really an important point. Hybrid is the full spectrum. It also includes military tools, and Ukraine has absolutely experienced that. Georgia has absolutely experienced that. But we also experience it when Russia moves military equipment around, when it makes nuclear threat. It's all combined as part of a strategy. So it's not like there's the military stuff and then there's hybrid. The full spectrum is hybrid. NATO is very strong on the military side. We're a little bit less strong than the EU when it comes to civilian tools. The EU is very strong on civilian tools. It's obviously weaker than NATO when it comes to the military side. So a very close NATO-EU collaboration, which is not as easy as it should be for political reasons, would make a whole lot of sense.
Right. Victoria, have you seen more or less interest in the center activities in Helsinki over the last 6 months or not?
Oh, definitely more.
More, yeah.
It's interesting how the tables have turned from yesterday, when the NATO strategic concept discussion received the question, do you think that hybrid threats overshadow the kinetic part? So we're now discussing a completely different question from the other side, or the same question. So I think it is first and foremost important that in the NATO strategic concept, hybrid threats can also call out now Article 5. So it means that we're also talking about deterrence of hybrid threats on the NATO level. And I will agree. So hybrid threats work across all spectrum of different domains, and I don't think today any war would happen without hybrid threats there.
Yeah. Ainius, briefly before we let go.
Yeah, I very much agree with my Latvian colleague that I think in the Baltic States we actually were preparing and expecting actually sometimes even more. With refugees coming in as well, and all this discussion about how do we educate, how do we change our educational system and adjust, very much there, all of these things. So that's definitely hybrid threats are also information space. I mean, it's very, we got in Lithuania, we got attacks on our media immediately during this beginning of the war. So it's very much there, and I think everybody is kind of uberly eager to react and counter sort of to deter any narrative that comes out potentially suspicious. And sometimes that's I would say it's sometimes a bit even worrisome, because then you kind of suppress, and my sometimes fear, and I say, in Lithuania sometimes, I say, let's not become inverse Russia. Let's not become this kind of patriotic, no, we are now the best, and we, and it's kind of the inverse of it. You don't want to kind of suppress every other thought and discussion, but really to find the right balance. But I think we are there.
We are here to defend the open, free society and democratic society. So we have a sort of about 15 minutes left, and we want to have some questions from the audience. And Shota, and then the lady next to him, and then we take one question from online, and then we return back to the panel. And please introduce yourself very briefly.
Hello, this is Shota Guineria from the Baltic Defense College. And I was going to ask a question about the threshold, because we still keep discussing hybrid warfare as if it was something before the conventional war instrument of power comes in, but James and Viktorija both nailed it. So we have the answer now that the hybrid warfare is sort of a full spectrum of instruments of national power being used in a coordination. But then my question would be, why NATO and the European Union both walked away from the hybrid warfare term and switched to hybrid threats? Because the rationale was exactly that it's not warfare because it does not include bullets and rockets and stuff, in my understanding. And the second part of my question goes to more practical considerations in Ukraine. So 2014 versus 2022. So we have seen in 2014 was that Russia was able to achieve its objectives without a need for conventional full-scale war. And in 2022, they had to go to conventional warfare because their hybrid other instruments of non-military instruments of power failed to achieve the objectives they have set to themselves. What does this tell us about this discussion about the nature of hybrid warfare, whether it is something before the conventional war starts, or conventional warfare is actually part of hybrid strategy, as James and Viktorija told us? Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, Dr. Hanna Shelest, Ukrainian Prism. I have a question to Mr. Appathurai. You've been talking about the multilateral approach, but at the same time, when we read the NATO documents, all the summit declarations, it is all the time striking that is emphasis on that resilience is the national business. And each time it is very strong words emphasizing that it's not a general or multilateral, that is national responsibility. And even more, we almost witness that there is a disconnection between the NATO members and partners in terms of the response, or in terms of the resilience building, or the sharing experience in this. So I understand that is your personal opinion, you emphasize it, but at the same time, why do you feel that here several speakers spoke about multilateral approach, but at the official level you have stress on the national level?
Thank you. And there's one question here from the online audience about if there are any specific best practices from the Baltic states, lessons learned that could be applied and scalable to the whole of NATO and EU, and so forth. So I open the floor here. So we had a question of why did we walk away from the term hybrid warfare? And just as an add-on note to this, because I used to work as Sweden's first ambassador for countering hybrid threats, and I also had to learn about international law. And I also learned that war is not a term that is defined in international law. Aggressionist, armed attack is, and so forth, but war is not. Then we had a question on, the difference between 2014 and 2022, what happened in between. I'm not necessarily agreeing with Shota, because there was a kinetic war going on since 2004. The war didn't start in 22, but it was a massive escalation, so to say. And then we talk about international cooperation, but always stress this national responsibility. And do we make an unnecessary dividing line between allies and partners? And lastly, are there any specific, unique sort of Baltic lessons that could be applied, learned for others? So who wants to start? James, you look.
Yeah, why don't I just get it going? On the question from our Ukrainian colleague, you read the documents correctly. And there is a heavy emphasis on national responsibility. And I would say there's sort of three reasons why, but then there's a kicker. One is, it is the reality that when it comes to resources, legislation, regulation, 99% of this, really, the vast proportion is national. The second reason is that from a NATO point of view, we are intergovernmental, not like the EU. So I think the EU might have a different approach to this than we do. The third reason is, and this is on the part of some of the countries that have insisted on language like that in the communiques, it's what they call moral hazard. In other words, they really want to ensure that all allies lean on themselves first and don't look to sort of an outside actor to come and save them, and therefore under-resource their own national resilience. So that's sort of the impetus behind it, and of course there's a logic to it within its limits. But then the final point, and this is what my friend who was sitting up on this stage yesterday said when talking about resilience, and that is, we say national responsibility but collective commitment, and that is also language in our communiques. It's also in Article 3 of the NATO Charter. It is a collective commitment to each other that you're not the weak link in the chain. And so we have some small tools at NATO. We're trying to beef them up to provide support from the alliance point of view. But the collective commitment to national resilience and is in the Charter, so they need to do that. I won't speak to the Baltic states, just to say, you know, the warfare terminology, I think there is a legal aspect to it. You'll see that the documents that we have just approved in Madrid talk about strategic competition. We say that cyberspace is permanently contested, which I think is a good way of looking at it, because it is. There is no peace, crisis, conflict in cyberspace. It's always on, it's always contested right now. So we're definitely approaching that particular environment in a different way than we are the conventional. But I really think it's important to see it, and I know you do that, Shota, as a spectrum. And that is, for example, Russia uses and has used its military buildups, its exercises, as part of a hybrid campaign to draw your forces away, to send a political message, to intimidate, and has done that in combination with other measures. So the actual employment of force is, yes, the end of the spectrum, but it's clearly just a spectrum where military tools are used throughout, and not just near the end or at the end.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to pick up? Victoria?
Sure. Thank you for very good questions. I will pick up one about the hybrid warfare happening before the conventional war or after. So we use this kind of conceptual, I won't call it model, it's too arrogant words to name it, but this, I will call it escalation and situational awareness paradox. So let's say we have three levels. We have hybrid influence, and when you have hybrid influence, situational awareness, there is none. So you don't know what's happening actually. Some stuff might be happening, but you don't know about them. So escalation level between you and the hostile actor is low. When you go into interference, you have this issue of plausible deniability. So you know stuff that is happening. Some of them you might attribute, but then even if you attribute, the hostile actor says, no, it's not us, or this is not happening. Escalation level will be a bit more higher, but the problem is when you go to warfare, actually. So you can then attribute exactly what's happening, but the escalation is so high, you can no longer manage it, I mean, with the forward-looking tools or with the resilience tools, and you have to more and more incrementally resort to punishment tools. So this is sort of how I understand if it comes before and after, it's like always there. And then on the Baltic experience in hybrid threats and what could we learn. So I think one lesson that could be learned from the Baltics is actually a trust in the situational awareness that they provide. And during the last couple or few months, I heard many times, you know, you were right, you Baltics were right. But the next thing I would hear that the sanctions against Russia will have to be removed. So the trust in the Baltic situational awareness, the trust in what the partners are saying, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm. Ainius, do you want to pick up?
Sure, I'll pick up this 2014-2022. From my point of view, this contrast between the two is really, it is about resilience, and it is about society, not just resilience as such, but also kinetic, you know, like actual resistance. What happened in 2014 and reaction, Western reaction to it, was very, very feeble and late. And I think the same is actually, we can conclude the same for 2022. It's late and feeble initially. And just because Ukraine stood up for the first month, then all the processes started to kick in. But if the situation would have been different, I would expect, you know, just our Western reaction would have probably been something like 2014 plus, you know, just a little bit more, but not much more. And that, well, that's my at least assessment, and that worries me. But that also tells us about the importance of, you know, society, the importance of society, its ability to kind of, you know, identify, resist, and also both, you know, in sort of hybrid dimension, but also in the actual, you know, warfare.
Okay. Elīna?
Yeah, we have less than a minute left. I think that what perhaps other countries can learn from Baltics is this deterrence by denial, because obviously we don't have the tools that other partners have to practice deterrence by punishment or retaliation. And I think we're getting better and better in that. And the recent events in the context of war in Ukraine, so for example, how we have been removing the monuments glorifying Soviet history, and how well or relatively well that has been handled, I think proves that if you do your homework, if you do prepare for the worst, you take away the will of your opponent or adversary to actually prevent you from achieving what you want to achieve. So I guess that's probably the general comment.
Thank you. Maybe I could just add, from my own personal experience, to Shota's question, because I think a long time people were seeing that hybrid threats were, this was a sort of the gray zone, this was a kind of preparation on the way to the real thing, which is a kinetic war. And I think we all realize that this can be the case, but of course hybrid threats is you know, they can play out under the threshold of a kinetic war. And this is not a potential hypothetical risk that we have to prepare for. It's going on 24/7 in all kinds of sectors and spheres of so forth. I think we've had a very, very useful and good panel. There's a lot of things have been done, but much remains to be done. No room for complacency. We discussed a lot of vertical escalation these days, and there's a lot of focus on going all the way and including nuclear weapons and so forth. But let's not forget the sort of the horizontal escalation, which a lot of which can take place in the sphere of hybrid threats, and I think we will continue to see and perhaps see even more of that. We have learned about this whole cognitive, how we mentally prepared, how what kind of discussions do we have within our own societies, how do we prepare for this, and another lesson has been resilience is very important. Situational awareness is also important, but difficult. But we also need to impose costs and respond to this both nationally and in the international cooperation. I, who have been moderating this discussion, my name is Fredrik Löfqvist, and I'm director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies in Stockholm. And I've also been exposed to some fake news here, because I think in at least one of the programs I'm called Dr. Fredrik Löfqvist, and I'm absolutely doctor of nothing, and I'm not an academic. But I used to be an ambassador for countering hybrid threats when I was still in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I think we should give this wonderful panel a warm round of applause.